you have taken the time to look at most of the videos here, you should be feeling a lot more confident in working within the FL Studio environment. However, there are a few areas of the program that are not so exclusive to FL Studio alone, but having a great understanding of what they do will help you further enhance your production abilities. So let's take a look at some of these tools. In this video, we're going to look at LFOs a little more in depth. And an LFO is an acronym for Low Frequency Oscillator. And to pick that term apart a little, an oscillator can be thought of as a generator that produces a waveform. Now, depending on which type of devices you are working with, this oscillator can be used as an engine to a sound source, such as an FM synthesizer, or it could be used to modulate another audio source. In the case of an LFO, the oscillator is producing a low-frequency waveform that is applied to an already generated sound source to further enhance that sound's character. Each channel in FL Studio comes equipped with an LFO section, which we took a brief look at in the previous videos. However, you actually have access to 5 LFOs. Each one is being used to modulate its own destination. You have an LFO that can be used to modulate the panning of a sample to create an automatic panning effect. You can also apply LFO modulation to the volume, the cutoff filter, the resonance filter, as well as the pitch control to really expand the sound's character and dynamics. Let's start by covering what each control the LFO does. Then we'll take a look at how to apply them. I'm going to begin with the panning LFO. While I am making adjustments to the LFO section, keep your eyes on the waveform display. This display will give you a visual representation of what the LFO's waveform would look like. I will start with the amount knob, as it will be the first one you will typically reach for. The more amount you apply, the more the LFO is applied to the destination, in this case, the panning. When the amount knob is positioned in the center, no LFO modulation will be applied. Turning the amount knob to the right will increase the amount of modulation. Turning the knob to the left of the center also applies LFO modulation, however, the waveform will be in reverse phase. If I turn the delay control knob, you can see that the curve is pushed back, and the beginning is replaced with a flat line. This means that the LFO will not kick in right away. Instead, the LFO will wait and come in later in the sample. Great for when you are working with long samples where you want to paint a different picture with them over their duration. Now, as I turn up the attack knob, you can see that the starting point of the curve flattened out a little. This controls how fast the curve will go from its flatline state to the full curvature state. If you want the modulation to slowly become stronger over time, you would use the attack knob to control this. And the last control is the speed knob. This is how fast the frequency of the curve is. The more you turn this knob to the right, the faster the modulation will appear. So working with these controls, I can create some interesting stereo effects on the panning, as you have heard here. But let's take this idea further and create some dynamic effects with the volume LFO. To give an extreme example, I will turn the amount knob all the way to the right. Listen to how this sample continuously fades in and out. As I say, this is an extreme example. Bringing the amount knob back down, you can hear how the fades are not so dramatic and more subtle. One tip here is that you could use the LFO to slowly fade away a sample and have it slowly return. To show you an example, I will lower the speed of the LFO, then turn the amount knob to full so that it will completely fade out. Now listen as the sample slowly fades away, then returns. Perfect if you are working with a synth sample loop that you would want to appear in full swing at, say, the beginning of a bar, then have less presence for the last few beats. Now let's take a look at an effect that I am sure you have heard before, especially if you are working with a lot of electronic music. The effect I am referring to is the sweeping filter effect, the one where you hear a drum loop or a synth loop get muffled slowly over time, then return to its original tonal character. This effect is usually performed using modulated filters, and of course it is possible to do with FL Studio. In my sample, I have a simple 1-bar loop. Let's make that loop's tonal characteristics change over time to the one that I just described. First, we will need to be sure that the cutoff LFO is selected. Next, slow down the speed of the LFO a little. For this effect, we want the changes to happen slowly over time. Next, I will turn the amount knob up to about halfway. Now when you listen to the loop, you can hear it slowly becoming muffled over time. It's a great way to keep your loops from getting too repetitive. And as this effect does modulate the filters, you may want to adjust the filters a little as well to tweak the effect. And lastly, while we are working with a loop, if you want to tie the speed as well as the attack and delay times to the song's tempo, you only need to enable the TB button. These settings will now lock to the correct beat. The last LFO section is the pitch LFO section, which allows you to create some interesting pitch-based effects by modulating the source audio's pitch. Use this LFO to create some whammy-type sounds when the pitch moves up and down quickly, or even extremely slow modulation to have a note rise or lower slowly over time. So now we hope that you have a better understanding of what the LFO in FL Studio does. And the only rule I recommend is that it is important to experiment with the different LFOs and how it can enhance and add some spice to your sound's character.